It was just past 10:15 in the morning when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. These days, most calls were telemarketers. But something in me said to pick it up. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, almost detached. They were calling from the bank. There had been a change to my account. A new name added. My son's. For a moment, I didn't understand. My mind struggled to catch up with the words. My son, added to my account. The same account I'd managed carefully for decades. The one holding the savings I had built after my husband passed. I remember standing there in the kitchen, staring at the sunlight pooling across the counter, feeling as though the world had tilted ever so slightly out of place. I tried to reason with myself. It had to be a mistake. Maybe a clerical error. Maybe... No. Deep down, I already knew. There had been hints. Subtle things I didn't want to see. The rushed phone calls. The nervous tone when I mentioned money. The way he stopped visiting unless there was something to ask. That call wasn't just about my bank account. It was the sound of trust shattering. It was the moment I realized that love, the kind a mother gives freely, can be used against her. And as I stood there, holding the phone with trembling hands, one thought came over me. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something I never saw coming. Most mornings in my house began the same way. At 7:15 a.m., the coffee pot gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with that rich, comforting smell I'd come to depend on. The same chipped mug waited on the counter. The same soft hum from the refrigerator kept me company. I'd fold the laundry that had been sitting in the basket since yesterday, switch on the old radio, and let the voices fill the quiet. It wasn't that I loved the noise. I just needed proof that the world outside still moved while mine stood still. After breakfast, I'd sit by the window that overlooked Maple Street, a cup in hand and the morning sun spilling across the worn kitchen table. I'd read the same old newspaper, even though I already knew most of what it would say. It was routine. Something familiar to hold on to when life felt uncertain. Sometimes, I'd think about my husband, Robert. We built a small laundromat together back in the early years. A tiny place with peeling paint and machines that clanked louder than they should. But we were proud of it. Every towel washed. Every coin collected. It was ours. When he passed, it felt like the world lost its rhythm. The house became quieter. The air heavier. I filled the silence with chores, grocery lists, and phone calls that always ended too soon. People said I was strong, that I'd adjusted well. But the truth was, I wasn't strong. I was just steady. There's a difference. Strength fights the storm. Steadiness learns to stand in the rain without falling apart. My days were simple. Predictable. The mail arrived at noon. The kettle whistled at 5. And I'd turn off the lights at 10:30. It was a life I told myself I was grateful for. A kind of peace I'd earned after so many years of noise and struggle. But looking back now, I realize it wasn't peace. It was pause. A long, quiet pause between the life I had loved and the one I was about to lose again. Because I didn't know it then. But that stillness I had grown used to was about to be shattered. And it would start with a knock on my door. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Daniel and Marissa stopped by. I'd been up since early morning, dusting the shelves, baking cornbread, and setting out the good plates. The ones with the tiny blue flowers Robert and I used every Thanksgiving. I told myself it was just a normal visit, that maybe they wanted to spend time with me. The house felt brighter somehow, like it had been waiting for laughter to fill it again. When they arrived, Marissa smiled politely, her eyes scanning the living room more than my face. Daniel gave me a quick hug. Light. Distracted. Like his body was already half turned toward the door. Still. I told myself not to mind. Families get busy. Maybe they were tired. Maybe I was reading too much into it. We sat in the kitchen, the smell of coffee mixing with cinnamon from the cornbread. They asked about my health, about the house, about little things that didn't really matter. Their words were polite, but their eyes kept darting toward each other. Quiet exchanges passing between them that I couldn't quite read. I remember feeling this strange distance sitting right there at the table with us, as if something invisible had slipped in between mother and son. At one point, I mentioned how I still managed the bills myself, that I was proud to have saved a little something for my later years. It wasn't meant as a boast. Just a small truth from an old woman trying to sound capable. And then Daniel laughed. Not cruelly, but carelessly. Like my life's work was a funny story from the past. It was a soft sound, but it hit me harder than I expected. The air in the room shifted. I felt the warmth drain from my chest. In that moment, I saw it clearly. He didn't see me as his mother anymore. Not the woman who'd worked beside his father. Not the one who'd built everything they had. He saw someone fragile. Someone to manage. Someone in the way. I sat there, holding my coffee as it grew cold, pretending not to notice the silence settling in. My hands trembled, but I kept my smile. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I was being sensitive. But deep inside, something small and sharp began to take root. A whisper I couldn't ignore. That visit ended with hugs and polite goodbyes. But I knew something had changed. The moment he laughed was the moment I began to see my son differently. And not long after, the phone would ring, and that whisper would turn into truth. It was a little after 2:30 p.m. when the house fell into that soft afternoon stillness, the kind that makes you aware of every small sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the wall clock, the sigh of the wind against the window pane. I was pouring hot water into my favorite mug, the one with a tiny chip on the rim, when the phone rang. At first, I almost let it go to voicemail, but something, an instinct I couldn't explain, made me reach for it. I remember pressing the receiver to my ear, expecting a telemarketer or wrong number. Instead, there was a gentle, professional voice. Someone from the bank. They said they were calling to confirm recent changes to my account. My heart skipped, though I didn't know why. I listened quietly, my mind already searching for reason, changes I hadn't requested any. Then, they said a name. My son's name. And something inside me went very still. I remember how my hand froze midair. The cup of tea forgotten on the counter. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. I tried to stay calm, nodding as though I were taking notes. Even though my body felt miles away, my son had tried to add himself to my account. Without my knowledge, without my consent? The representative went on, explaining that the paperwork was incomplete, that my signature was missing, that nothing had gone through. I heard the words clearly, but they didn't feel real. It was as if my mind had split. Half of me listening, half of me standing beside myself, watching an old woman realize that love can turn quietly against her. When the call ended, I set the phone down gently, afraid the silence would shatter me. I could hear the kettle still whistling, the sound piercing through the numbness. I turned it off and just stood there, both hands pressed against the counter, staring at the chipped mug. After a long moment, I reached for my blue notebook, the one where I wrote grocery lists and reminders. And on a blank page, I wrote 4 simple words: I'm still the owner. Those words steadied me. They didn't erase the hurt or the disbelief, but they reminded me that I hadn't lost everything. Not yet. That was the moment I woke up. The first spark of awareness, after years of silence and trust I'd mistaken for peace. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too still, and the silence had a weight to it, as if even the air knew something had changed. I lay in bed with my eyes open, watching the faint light from the street lamp stretch across the ceiling. The clock on the dresser ticked steadily, each second louder than the one before. I could hear the heater hum, the sound of my own breathing, the small rhythm of a life that had been quiet for too long. I kept thinking about the call, about the voice on the other end, saying my son's name. I replayed every moment, every word, until the realization sank in fully. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the woman who built a business, who made decisions, who trusted her instincts. I had become someone who avoided conflict, who said yes when I wanted to say no, who believed that love meant keeping the peace, no matter the cost. But as I lay there, I began to see it differently. Peace without choice isn't peace. It's surrender. And silence, I realized, can be its own kind of prison. When morning came, I didn't make coffee like usual. I brewed tea instead. It felt small, almost insignificant. But it was a start. Something different. Something chosen. The steam rose in slow curls as I sat at the kitchen table, Ben in hand, and opened my blue notebook again. I wrote down everything I'd let others handle. My bank account, my bills, even the way my days unfolded, line by line. It hit me how much of my life had been handed over in the name of trust. I had thought I was being kind, but maybe I'd just been afraid. By the time the tea had cooled, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't go back to who I was before that call. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I was ready to face it. For the first time in years, I felt awake, and I wasn't done yet. That morning, I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I took my time getting ready. Pressed slacks, a cream blouse, the pearl earrings Robert gave me on our 25th anniversary. They'd been sitting untouched in a drawer for years. When I fastened them, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw someone I hadn't met in a long time. A woman who looked steady, not scared. I slipped my blue notebook into my purse. The same one that still held the words, "I'm still the owner." My hands were calm now, not trembling like they had been the day of the call. Every motion, buttoning my coat, locking the door, stepping into the cool morning air, felt deliberated, like small declarations of self-respect. The bank smelled the same as always. Fine coffee, paper, and the cold whir of the air conditioner. But walking through those glass doors felt different this time. It wasn't just a place where numbers lived. It was where my name, my choices, my independence had almost been erased. Philip, the manager, greeted me with his usual professionalism. I could see in his eyes a hint of concern, maybe even pity. But I met his gaze without flinching. I explained what I wanted. Clear, direct, no hesitation. The forms were brought out. I sat at that desk, my notebook beside me, Ben in hand, and began signing. Line after line, I removed my sons' and daughter-in-law's names from the account. With each stroke of the pen, it was as if a thread that had been tightening around my chest began to loosen. I didn't feel angry. I felt clean, clear, as though the fog that had been following me for years was finally lifting. When it was done, Philip confirmed everything. My account, my name, my control. He said something polite. I can't remember what, but I do remember the sound of the paper sliding into the folder. Crisp and final. Outside, the sunlight hit me full in the face. I stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, feeling it fill me completely. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't hiding anymore. As I walked toward my car, I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about finally choosing myself, It was early afternoon when I heard the knock. The kind that isn't hurried, but deliberate. 3 even taps against the wood. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Marissa stood there. Her smile perfectly practiced. A kind of politeness that carried more tension than warmth. She held a small paper bag from the bakery down the street. The same one she used to bring when she wanted something. I invited her in. Out of habit more than desire. The house felt smaller with her inside. I could sense the unease in her movements. Too careful. Too measured. As she settled at the kitchen table, I poured us both tea. The same way I always had. But this time the ritual felt different. I wasn't hosting, I was observing. She began softly, with phrases about misunderstandings and just trying to help. Her voice carried that delicate balance of sweetness and control. Every word designed to remind me of my age, of my supposed fragility. For years, I might have nodded, offered apologies I didn't owe. But that morning, I only listened. As she talked, I noticed her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. The faint impatience when I didn't fill the silence with agreement. Then the tone shifted. Politeness, giving way to quiet irritation. She said things meant to make me question myself, to stir guilt, to suggest that my son had only been protecting me. But I could see it now. The pattern. The way care could be used as a leash. Inside, I felt something steady rise up. Not anger, but certainty. I realized that not every battle needed to be loud to be won. So I spoke calmly. My voice even. Telling her that I had taken care of things myself and that everything was in order. I thanked her for coming. And I meant it. Not out of politeness, but because this visit had shown me just how far I'd come. She sat still for a moment, caught between confusion and disbelief. Then she gathered her purse, muttered something about being misunderstood, and walked toward the door. The air shifted when it closed behind her. For a long time, I stood there in the quiet, the sound of the kettle soft in the background. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't mind. The house didn't feel smaller anymore. It felt mine again. And for the first time in a long while, peace didn't feel like silence. It felt like freedom. The morning after Marissa's visit, the house felt lighter. Though the quiet still lingered in the corners, I was folding a few towels in the living room when the phone rang. It was Anna, my granddaughter. Her voice trembled just a little when she asked if she could come by. I told her she could. Of course. And within the hour, I heard her car pull into the driveway. When I opened the door, she stood there uncertain, clutching her backpack, eyes searching mine as if for permission to still belong. She was growing into such a lovely young woman, graceful in that awkward way only youth can be. Half girl, half grown. I could see the weight she carried. Though, the kind that doesn't belong to someone her age. I invited her in. The scent of cinnamon lingered from the muffins I'd baked earlier. And I saw her notice it. She smiled faintly. It was the first time I'd seen that smile in months. We moved around the kitchen quietly at first. 2 people trying to find their rhythm again. She helped me stir the batter for another batch. Her movements careful. Reverent almost. As though she feared breaking the fragile calm between us. Eventually, she spoke. Hesitant. But honest. She said she didn't understand what had happened between her father and me. That she felt caught in the middle. I could hear the confusion and guilt threading through her words. I reached over and touched her hand. Felt it trembling slightly. I told her that none of it was her fault. That sometimes adults make choices out of fear and pride, not love. And then I told her the truth. That I loved her father. But I couldn't let that love cost me myself anymore. Her eyes filled then. Not from shame, but relief. I think she'd been waiting to hear something that made sense of it all. I stood and went to the small cabinet near the hallway. The one that held my blue notebook. I handed it to her gently. Inside were pages of thoughts, lessons, and little pieces of advice. Things I wish someone had told me when I was her age. She opened it slowly, tracing my handwriting with her fingertips, and then looked up at me. For the first time, I saw understanding there. Not pity. Not confusion. Just love. When she left that afternoon, I watched her car disappear down the road. The sunlight stretched across the porch, warm and steady. I realized that day that legacies aren't built through inheritance or control. They live through the courage to be honest, to love without losing yourself. And in that moment, I knew something good was beginning again. It was late afternoon when the phone rang. The sun had dipped low enough that its light brushed the edge of the curtains, painting the room in golden shadow. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. When I looked down and saw Daniel's name glowing on the screen, my breath caught in that small, quiet way that only years of love and disappointment can teach you. For a long moment, I just stared at it. That name held everything. His first steps, his teenage arguments, the way he used to kiss my cheek before running out the door to school. And now, it carried the memory of a bank call that had changed everything. I let the phone ring twice before I answered. My voice sounded calm, almost detached, though my heart trembled somewhere deep beneath the surface. He spoke quickly at first. I could hear the strain in his tone, the mixture of guilt and defensiveness. There was talk of misunderstandings, of intentions twisted by circumstance. I listened quietly, my fingers tracing the rim of my teacup. There was a time when I would have interrupted to comfort him, to shoulder his mistakes as my own. But not now. Now, my silence had weight. It was not passive. It was presence. When he finally ran out of words, I spoke. I didn't raise my voice or fill the air with blame. I simply said what I had carried for years. That love isn't ownership. That respect is not earned by control. I told him I forgave him. Not because it was easy, but because carrying anger would only keep both of us small. But forgiveness, I reminded him, is not the same as forgetting. Trust must grow again, if it ever will. And this time, it has to be built on honesty. There was a pause on the line, the kind that stretches long enough to feel like a lifetime. I could hear his breathing, uneven, almost childlike. Then, without words, I understood. He finally knew what he had broken. When I ended the call, I didn't cry. I sat there for a while, watching the light fade from the walls, feeling the quiet settle around me. For the first time, that silence didn't hurt. It was full of something new. Space, peace, truth. And in that stillness, I realized the conversation hadn't been about loss. It had been about letting go. Of guilt. Of fear. Of the version of myself that had always said yes. The days that followed felt different. Quieter. But not empty. The storm had passed. And what remained was not wreckage, but stillness. I woke each morning with a kind of calm I hadn't known in years. My tea tasted warmer. The air inside the house lighter. Even the ticking clock on the mantel no longer sounded like a reminder of what I'd lost, but of what I still had. Time. One afternoon, I sat at my desk with the blue notebook beside me and a folder of papers spread neatly across the surface. I was rewriting my will. The act itself was simple. Signatures. Names. Decisions. But the meaning ran deeper. For the first time, every choice on that page felt entirely mine. No one whispering what was best. No guilt shaping my pen. Just quiet certainty. I left fair shares where fairness was due. But more than property or savings, what I wanted to leave behind was intention. I added a letter for Anna. folded neatly in the back of the folder. It wasn't about money, it was about freedom. I wanted her to know that independence is not selfishness. That love can coexist with boundaries. That forgiveness does not require surrender. When I finished, I set the pen down and watched the ink dry. Dark at first, then softening into permanence. It struck me how much of my life had been lived in pencil. Irascible. Uncertain. This moment, though, was written in ink. I looked around my living room. The framed photo of my husband by the window. The small plant Anna had given me. The sunlight pooling across the floorboards. The house no longer felt like a place of memory alone. It was mine again. Alive in the present. I felt gratitude rise in me. Not for what had been taken, but for what had been returned, my voice. Me dignity. My peace. Outside, a bird lifted from the edge of the fence, wings catching the afternoon light. It rose higher with each beat. Effortless and sure. I smiled, realizing that freedom, like that, doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it's as simple as signing your own name and meaning it. And as I closed the folder, I knew my legacy was no longer something to be guarded. It was something to be lived. These days, my mornings begin with light. The kind that spills softly through the kitchen window, touching everything it meets without asking permission. I sit with my tea, feeling the warmth travel through my hands, and realize that the silence surrounding me no longer feels like absence. It feels like peace. The kind I had mistaken for loneliness before, but now understand as freedom. I've come to see that pain, when faced with honesty, becomes a kind of teacher. It strips away illusions. It humbles you. And it quietly asks who you are when everything you leaned on is gone. I once believed my worth lived in being needed, in keeping everyone else comfortable, even at the expense of myself. But life has a way of returning us to our truest center. If we're willing to listen, what I've learned is simple. Though it took me a lifetime to say it aloud, love is not measured by sacrifice. And forgiveness does not mean forgetting who you are. There is strength in stillness, in saying no with grace, and in choosing peace even when others do not understand it. Sometimes, I wonder how many people are out there right now, sitting quietly at their own kitchen tables, feeling small or unseen, waiting for permission to reclaim their lives. If that's you, I want you to know this: it's never too late to begin again. You do not owe anyone your silence. You deserve to feel light, to make choices that honor who you are becoming, not just who you've been. Outside my window, the world continues on. Birds tracing arcs across the morning sky. Neighbors walking their dogs. The sound of laughter drifting from somewhere unseen. Life keeps moving. And so do we. If this story has found its way into your heart, take a moment. Breathe. Reflect. Share it with someone who might need the reminder. Because every story of healing, no matter how quiet, has the power to light another. And that, I think, is how legacies truly live on. Not in what we leave behind, but in what we awaken in each other.